My name is Lucinda Marin. I'm 65 years old. That Thursday morning, the phone rang just as sunlight cut through the kitchen blinds, striping the table in gold. I nearly let it go to voicemail these days. Silence was easier, but when I saw my son's name flash across the screen, my hands began to shake. "Dress nice, Mom," Evan said. "We're taking you somewhere special." His voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in months, maybe years. Before I could answer, I heard his wife in the background, bright and polished as ever. "Don't be late, Lucinda. You'll love this place." For a heartbeat, the room felt lighter. The kettle hummed behind me. A soft reminder that life still moved forward even when people didn't call. I pressed the phone closer, trying to memorize the sound of my son speaking kindly. "All right," I managed, careful to steady my voice. "What time should I be ready, 6? And wear something nice like you used to." The line went dead before I could say goodbye. I stood there for a while, listening to the quiet return. My pulse still caught somewhere between joy and caution. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish. The framed photos on the wall watched me like silent witnesses. I set the phone down, smoothed the front of my apron, and whispered to no one. Somewhere special. Outside, the afternoon light shifted over the oaks on Whitaker Street, the same trees my husband had planted decades ago. I hadn't worn anything nice in a long time. Still, I went to the bedroom and opened the wardrobe, fingers brushing the fabric of a floral dress I hadn't touched since his funeral. It might be time, I thought, to bring it back into the light. I spent the next morning dusting the house the way I used to before company came. The scent of lemon wax followed me from room to room. My old cat, Milo, trailed behind, his paws soft against the hardwood. It felt strange, preparing for something I didn't fully understand, but the motion steadied me. I found the floral dress folded neatly in the back of the wardrobe, wrapped in tissue paper like a memory that had been waiting to breathe again. Charles had loved that dress, the pale blue one with small white roses. He used to say it made me look like spring had walked into the room. I pressed the wrinkles out carefully, running the iron over each fold until it felt new again. On the dresser, a photograph of Evan as a boy smiled back at me, mud on his knees. A missing tooth, joy so bright it hurt to remember. I brushed my fingers across the frame, whispering his name as if he might answer from another time. When I stepped outside to shake the dust cloth, I saw May from across the street watering her hydrangeas. "You're going out," she called, shading her eyes. "My son's taking me somewhere special," I said. May smiled, then hesitated. "That's nice. Lou, just don't expect too much." "All right," I nodded, pretending not to hear the caution in her voice. "I'll be fine," I told her, though my throat felt tight. Inside again. I slipped the dress over my shoulders, smoothing it against my hips. The fabric was cool and soft, carrying faint traces of cedar from the wardrobe. For the first time in years, I looked in the mirror and saw someone hopeful, staring back. By late afternoon, the sky over Savannah glowed the color of pale honey. I waited on the porch, the hem of my floral dress brushing against my knees, listening for the familiar sound of Evan's car. When it finally turned the corner, the sight of him stepping out taller, older, but still my boy made something in my chest loosen. "Mom, you look great," he said, smiling as he opened the passenger door. His tone was easy, though his eyes darted briefly toward the house, as if avoiding the weight of memory that clung to it. Kendra leaned over from the driver's seat, sunglasses perched on her head. "We're so glad you're coming," she said brightly. "It's been too long since we did something together." The car smelled faintly of her perfume, sharp and sweet, the kind that filled every corner. We drove past the cobblestone streets of the old district, where the air still carried traces of salt from the river. Kendra kept talking about the future, about how busy things had been, how important it was to plan ahead. Evan murmured agreement now and then, but his hands stayed tight on his knees, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I wanted to ask what this somewhere special really was, but something in his voice earlier had warned me not to. So I nodded. Watching the world pass outside the window, the familiar live oak slowly thinning, replaced by wide gray stretches of highway. The laughter in the car felt practiced, every word carefully placed. My stomach tightened with a quiet unease I couldn't quite name. When we turned off the main road, a white sign rose ahead, neat and polished in the sun. Magnolia Haven Senior Living. I felt my hands still in my lap as the car slowed. The air inside seemed to thicken, sweet with perfume and silence. The car rolled to a stop in front of a row of manicured hedges and tall white columns. The sign gleamed in the late light, every letter perfect and deliberate. Magnolia Haven Senior Living. Kendra clapped her hands once, as if she'd just completed a surprise party. Ta-da! We thought you'd love it, she said, already pulling out her phone. The bright lens turned toward me. Smile. Lucinda, let's show everyone how beautiful this place is. I blinked at her, momentarily stunned. The world moving half a second slower than it should. Evan stepped out first, circling to open my door. It's just a quick tour, he said softly. You'll see it's really nice. Safe, too. The word safe echoed somewhere deep in my ribs. I followed them through the glass doors into a lobby that smelled of lavender and polished tile. Behind the counter, a young woman in a pale uniform smiled mechanically. Welcome, Mrs. Marin. We've been expecting you. Kendra beamed, handing the receptionist a folder she'd pulled from her purse. Here's everything you asked for: insurance, ID, all that. I filled out most of the forms already. I looked down at the papers as they were laid neatly before me. My name appeared over and over again, typed, initialed, dated. Move-in authorization, medication management, financial consent. Each title blurred into the next. I don't understand, I whispered, disbelief tightening my chest. You signed these without asking me. Evan shifted beside me, rubbing the back of his neck. It's just to hold a spot. Mom, you don't have to stay right away. We just thought since you've been alone, maybe this would make things easier. Kendra touched my arm lightly, her manicured nails cold against my skin. We want what's best for you. You'd have people around all the time, activities, fresh meals, no more worries. I met her gaze, then looked back at Evan. So this, I said slowly, is the somewhere special. Neither of them spoke. For a long moment, I stood there, the forms spread out like a map of my own erasure. Then I picked up the pen that lay waiting beside them and set it back down, carefully, as if placing something dangerous out of reach. I followed them through the building as if the air itself had grown heavier. A nurse in soft shoes greeted us and led the way toward a courtyard lined with azaleas and small benches painted white. The flowers were lovely, someone had clearly cared for them, but everything else felt rehearsed. Like a stage set for a scene I hadn't agreed to play in. Kendra walked beside me, her voice smooth and practiced. See, it's charming. They even have art classes and live music nights. You'll make friends in no time. I nodded, pretending to listen. It is very nice, I murmured. My reflection in the glass door looked steady, composed, though I could feel my pulse fluttering against my wrist. Evan stayed a few steps behind, answering short texts on his phone, avoiding my eyes. I wondered if he'd ever once stopped to imagine how it felt to be planned for while still standing on your own 2 feet. When the nurse turned to show Kendra the activity board, I took a slow breath and stepped aside. The scent of fresh mulch hung in the air. From inside my purse, I drew out my phone, the screen dim against the afternoon light. My fingers didn't tremble this time as I typed 3 words. File everything today. Make sure they see what's coming. Make. Then I pressed send and slid the phone back into the bag. By the time they looked for me again, I was sitting calmly on a bench beneath a magnolia tree, hands folded neatly in my lap. Kendra smiled for the camera once more. Perfect, she said, as if capturing proof of my consent. I smiled back. It really is peaceful here. Inside, my heart ached so sharply I thought it might break through my ribs, but my voice stayed even. The way Charles is used to when storms passed over the river. Quiet, measured, certain. Rain began to fall just as I reached Whitaker Street, the kind that softened the world into quiet shapes. The porch light flickered once when I unlocked the door, the familiar click echoing through the still house. Milo padded in behind me, shaking droplets from his fur. I hung my damp shawl by the door and stood for a moment in the silence. The day's polite voices still clung to me like perfume gone sour. Kendra's cheerful explanations, Evan's half-whispered reassurances. Every word had felt like a nail pressed gently, steadily, into my chest. I lit the lamp on the kitchen table, its yellow glow falling over a row of photo frames. Charles's smile looked the same as it always had, steady, amused. A man who understood how to build things that lasted. He had spent his life planning, measuring twice, never leaving a hinge loose or a door unsecured. I went to the study and opened the tall cabinet beside his old drafting desk. A thin layer of dust rose as I drew out the leather binder labeled Estate in Trust. The brass clasp clicked open easily. Inside were pages of neat handwriting, notarized letters, property deeds all organized with Charles's precision. He had always believed in preparing for storms. Years ago, when his health began to fail, he'd insisted we protect everything under my maiden name, Lucinda Vance, just in case. He'd said, smiling, "You're stronger when they don't see you coming." I ran my fingertips over the document's small duplexes in the historic district, a cottage near the marsh, all purchased quietly through his friend and attorney, Robert Hale, the same Robert who would now see that everything stayed safe exactly as Charles intended. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the river. I closed the binder and held it against my chest. "You always planned ahead for me, Charles," I whispered. The rain grew heavier, tapping against the window in steady rhythm. I felt calm, not from revenge, but from something deeper certainty. The house, the silence. Even the storm itself seemed to recognize it. The time for waiting had passed. Chapter 7. The Callback. 2 days passed before the phone rang again. The rain had lifted, leaving the air clean and heavy with the scent of magnolia. I was in the kitchen, rinsing the last of the breakfast dishes, when Kendra's name flashed across the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, but curiosity, sharper than anger, made me answer. "Lucinda," she said quickly, her voice high and thin. "Something's wrong with the bank. All our cards, every one of them, declined. Evan's been on hold for an hour." I set the towel down and leaned against the counter. "That must be frustrating," I said quietly. She drew a breath that trembled at the edges. "Did you do something? We can't access the joint accounts. The mortgage payment bounced. The bank says there's a freeze." From somewhere behind her, I heard Evan's voice low, strained. "Ask her what she did." "What I did," I said, my tone soft but clear. "I simply stopped pretending what's mine was yours." There was silence on the line, the kind that swells before a storm breaks. Then Evan came on. "Mom, please. You don't understand what this will do. We'll fix it, I swear. Just tell them to release the funds." I walked to the window, watching the sun fall through the wet branches of the oak outside. The leaves glistened like polished copper. I didn't freeze anything. "Evan, years ago, your father prepared everything. I just reminded the lawyer where the keys were. Everything else is mine to protect." He tried to speak, but the words tangled. I could almost picture him jaw tight. Fear finally cracking the calm surface he'd worked so hard to keep. "Mom," he said again, his voice breaking now. "We're not bad people. We just thought that I wouldn't notice." Another silence. Somewhere, a car horn blared faintly through the phone. Then Kendra spoke again, her tone clipped and desperate. "We'll lose everything. You can't let that happen." I turned from the window. My reflection ghosted against the glass. "You chose that long before today." Before they could reply, I ended the call. The phone felt warm in my hand for a moment, then still. The house was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I sat down at the table, folded my hands, and let the stillness settle. The fear that had shadowed me for days was gone, replaced by a calm that felt almost like mercy. Outside, sunlight spilled across the wet pavement, and the world carried on, untouched by their panic. The storm returned that evening, carried on a wind that shook the shutters and swept rain against the porch. I had just finished locking the side door when the pounding began, sharp, uneven, desperate. "Mom." Evan's voice cracked through the night. "Open up, please." I froze for a moment. The sound of it reaching down into every place that still remembered the boy who used to run home crying after a scraped knee. But this voice wasn't that boy's. It was heavier, frantic, carrying something that sounded like fear. Through the window's narrow pane, I saw them. Kendra stood beside him in the rain, her hair plastered to her face, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Evan's clothes were soaked, his phone clutched in one hand like a lifeline. Their car idled crookedly by the curb, headlights cutting through the downpour. "Please," he said again, hitting the door with the flat of his hand. "Just talk to me. We lost everything, our accounts. The house, it's all gone. They said it was fraud. Tell them you didn't mean it." Kendra's voice rose behind him, shrill and breaking. "You think this makes you righteous? You ruined us. You and your precious little lawyer." I stepped closer, close enough that the porch light caught the outline of my face in the glass. My pulse stayed steady. "Go home," I said, voice calm but unyielding. "There's nothing left for you here and never will be." Evan pressed his forehead against the door. "We don't have a home," he whispered. Before I could answer, the faint wail of sirens began to cut through the storm. Blue light flashed across the wet windows, growing brighter until 2 police cars turned onto Whitaker Street. I didn't have to call. Robert had already done what was needed. The officers approached calmly, voices even. "Mr. and Mrs. Marin, please step away from the property." Evan turned toward the lights, shoulders sagging. Kendra screamed something I couldn't hear. I stayed where I was, hand resting on the latch, watching as the blue and gold lights washed across the porch, then faded into the rain. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and rain. I arrived early, the sound of my shoes echoing against the marble floor. Steady and unhurried, Robert walked beside me. A quiet presence, as always. His leather briefcase tucked neatly under his arm. "You only need to tell the truth," he said. "That's all that matters." I nodded, though my heart felt heavier than I wanted to admit. Inside the small courtroom, everything was pale wood and muted light. Evan sat at the defense table, shoulders hunched, his tie slightly crooked. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence stripped away. Kendra sat beside him, arms crossed, her eyes darting between him and the floor. When the judge entered, the murmur of voices stilled. The proceedings began with the investigators' report numbers, signatures, accounts. Each word carried a weight that fell squarely on their side of the room. Robert presented the records Charles had safeguarded years before, tracing the paper trail that proved what was mine had never been theirs to touch. At last, the judge turned to Evan. "Do you wish to make a statement?" Evan hesitated. then rose slowly. His voice was quiet, almost childlike. I just wanted to help. We were in debt. I thought, if we managed her finances, we could make things easier for everyone. Kendra's head snapped toward him. Don't you dare blame me, she hissed. You signed everything. The judge raised a hand for silence. I kept my gaze on the table, steadying my breath. When it was my turn, I stood. Love isn't ownership, I said softly. It isn't permission to take what someone built from their own hands. I wanted my son to have peace, not power. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. All assets are to be restored to Mrs. Marin. Case closed. A faint hum rose from the back of the room. Reporters, whispers, the rustle of papers. Evans sank back into his chair, face buried in his hands. Kendra stared ahead, her expression hollow. Outside, the air was cool and bright after the storm. Cameras waited by the steps, questions overlapping in the humid air. I paused only once before leaving. I built my peace, I said quietly, the same way I built my life quietly. Then I walked away as the city bells began to ring across Savannah, slow and certain, like the sound of something finally set right. Months passed, and the city softened back into its rhythm. The air along Whitaker Street smelled of rain and gardenias, the kind of scent that carries both memory and mercy. Life grew quieter, but fuller. With Robert's help, I founded the Whitaker Fund, a small office downtown that offered free legal guidance to elders who'd been pressured or tricked by their families. Every story that came through the door felt painfully familiar, different names. Same wounds. Still, helping them brought a calm I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as the sun sank over the rooftops, I walked to the porch and switched on the light, the one Charles had wired himself decades ago. Its glow spread across the walkway, soft and steady. I stood there for a while, listening to the faint hum of cicadas and the distant bells from the cathedral. On the table inside waited a single envelope, Evan's handwriting. I opened it slowly. Mom, I finally understand. No apology, just that it was enough. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer beside Charles's old watch, and returned to the doorway. This light isn't for waiting anymore. I whispered, it's for peace.